Hey, what is up, you guys? It's Andy and Kat, the dynamic duo who never get to talk anymore. Well, today we're
Hmm.
talking, and we've got an exciting going back to ERP. So, Andy and I were literally just bantering, like previous to recording here, and we're just talking about what each other is doing. And Andy, I'll just set the stage for our listeners. Andy, if you don't recall, is an excellent, very seasoned consultant in the ERP space, specifically for Oracle ERP. And so, like, when we say seasoned, we mean back. I'm gonna date you. So back in the day, ERPs were always on implemented on-prem. So if you're listening to this podcast for the first time, we like to use a lot of acronyms. I apologize for that. One of the acronyms that we like to use is called ERP, which stands for Enterprise Resource Planning, which is a software, it's an information system that organizations use to manage their business. Okay, so we're talking about accounting and finance, we're talking about HR, we're talking about supply chain management, essentially the entire backbone of your business. It would be run by one of these systems. And it depends on what level, or sorry, what size of organization you're at. It would determine the type of system or the flavor of system that you implement, right? And so what Andy is involved in is very much the very large scale, Fortune 1000 type companies that run Oracle. And back when we were both in Oracle, we would implement something called on-premise, which means that your servers, all of the computers they're not in the cloud. They're very much sitting in a server room somewhere on some floor of the organization's facilities, right? And so, like, as we have journeyed on through the decades, now the big thing is cloud. Everybody wants to go to the cloud. And really what that means is that your servers is no longer going to be in your own organization, but it's going to be sitting in some sort of, they're called server farms, which is basically like a collection of computers sitting somewhere else at whoever, manages that server farm. It's usually like it is usually the software vendor who manages it, right? And I was asking Andy, like, what sort of the differences that he sees between when we used to implement information systems on premise, which is what we call it, where your servers are there with you physically and you're essentially managing the whole entire thing by yourself, versus cloud, in which it's managed essentially, like, all that tech is primarily managed. And I say primarily, Andy will fill in a lot of color here, but primarily managed by the software vendor,
Mhm.
right? So what are this, like, where do you guys, I mean, in terms of implementation, you were saying, why don't we start with, like, what you've seen in terms of the differences on a whole, and then kind of let's dive down.
Yeah, I think the old, like, and I'm just using it, and Kat is very kind calling me seasoned because it's just a nice way for saying old. But I think the old versions of ERP, especially the on-premise, and we used to have like on-demand or stuff that was
Mm-hmm.
like there were ERP systems that were on servers that were, off-site. But typically, the way Kat explained it is exactly the way it normally was. I mean, people had their own servers; they were within the facility or somewhere they had access to, and their own individuals, or might have had contractors kind of managing the database and the servers and the sort of the whole network around it. And I think that structure, one is, when we move to more cloud, where it is more in a server farm and managed by a third party of some type. I think one thing that happens is it's sort of like, and this is the way it's gone. So it's not going back. So this is the way it really is. But I think what's happened is a lot of stuff is sort of, when clients start to implement this, that's sort of just taken care of. And so that piece of it is sort of taken care of, and they don't really worry about it. It's just they get it. They say, okay, how much does it cost for us to manage or to have this service, and they go that route. But I think that it affects also the implementation, which is really where it comes down to the implementers on whoever is implementing, and especially the client when the software is going in, is to be even more diligent about being involved with how that implementation is going. Because what I think is, maybe it's a bad analogy, but I think of it sort of like automobiles. There's very few people, and I mean very, very few people who can work on their own car today. The cars are too
Yeah, of
technical. They just
course, yeah.
bring it somewhere and they let them work on it. You know, back when, I mean, I'm not very mechanical, but most people when I was growing up could work on their own vehicles. The engines were, and the vehicles were fairly straightforward for somebody
Yep.
who understood it, and they could go and change those parts. They understood how it worked. And I think today we don't know how the car works because it's so complicated, and we don't even start to even try to understand it. I think what I'm finding with the cloud-based applications is we're kind of in that space where when we implement it, and we start to use that application or those applications, and we start to implement it, we need to be even more diligent about trying to learn how it works. Like what are the features there? What are ways that we can really use it? And I know as a consultant, I'm trying to be more diligent around that, because I think a lot of times people are just kind of thinking it's sort of a big plug and play type of solution where, and they're not kind of getting the best out of it. So from a very high
Mhm.
level, I think
Yeah.
that's kind of what I'm experiencing.
Yeah, so we were just discussing as well, like the style in which you implement is also quite different from when we used to implement information systems on-prem. Like had mentioned that the client would be very much involved as opposed to now. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I found in the past, well, and I think when we look at the timelines of the old projects, we were talking 12 months, 18 months reality. Like when we would step foot on site into a client, you know, a 6-month project was pretty much unheard of. Those were really fast turnarounds. Like back when we go to the old
Yeah.
ERP systems.
Yep.
So we were talking a year to a year and a half. The cloud projects are typically, they tend to try to be quicker turnaround, 6 months, 9 months, faster. Um, and I think because of the fact that the cloud applications don't allow us to do any customizations, most organizations think it's going to be real quick. Let's just get it in, get the standard functionality stood up, and then we'll be okay. The challenge is that all companies are unique. They're unique around how they do things and what they need, and trying to fit that in is sometimes more difficult. I think this is really where the 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 consulting companies and the client need to be more involved with the very details around how the applications work. And some of that, I think, what we were talking about earlier, was the old systems. I mean, the previous versions, the on-prem ERP systems. Usually, the client would be involved with even some of the configuration, even if it was just
Mm-hmm.
overseeing it or they understood it. What I'm finding more and more now is that the clients really want that handled. They kind of talk more abstractly, more higher level, and they're not kind of getting down to those details around kind of how is it configured and what are the impacts of some of that configuration. And I think with that, I think we're losing some of that knowledge that the clients should have. And then sometimes even for the consultants understanding the real depth of what the clients need.
Are you still doing, like, as a consultant, are you still a functional consultant? Are you still doing the config for them, or are you sort of even passing it off to somebody at Oracle to do, and then you're just kind of facilitating?
Yeah, I'm doing the config. Yeah, the projects I've been on, the consultants are still doing the configuration, the ones that but I do know of organizations that will offload that configuration to either another group within their organization again, and really kind of have it as a step that's sort of detached from the
Yep.
client. And I think this is where, you know, anybody who's kind of constructed, let's say even a house, if you just tell somebody kind of what you need and then don't kind of watch it happen, it's
Hmm.
you're probably going to be disappointed, because
Yeah.
there's a lot of miscommunication between what you want. And as consultants, I know it's our job to try to make sure that we meet the client's needs and we fully understand what they want. But there's a lot of abstract. Most of our conversations are abstract. Like we say something and we assume that the other person really fully understands what we're trying to say. And we're not, and even when we start to get to very detailed conversations, I think we've talked about this before, where somebody will use the word accrual. And
Mm.
if you start to ask them, okay, what does the word, what do you mean by accrual? They'll
Yeah.
usually kind of look kind of confused at you, going like, what do you mean? You don't know
Yeah.
what the word accrual means. But until you start to explain, okay, this is what we mean, you don't fully understand. You might understand, okay, it's the booking of an entry, but what does that entry represent? And until we
Mm-hmm.
have those detailed conversations, we're really not. Again, we're a little too high level. We really need to
Yeah.
get deeper in these conversations, and I find some of those are some of the challenges I'm seeing, at least from a lot of the cloud implementations that I've experienced, at least.
That's interesting because the reason why we had the clients involved in config is because during UAT or and then like after go live, we literally transition to the client's operations to we're basically handing over the keys to your new shiny configured system and you got to manage it on your own.
Right.
So if they're not like being taught how to fish,
Mm,
how does that like how do you how are they going to support it after go live?
yeah,
What do
and
people usually do?
that's where some of the challenges are. And I think, again, going back in time, there were companies that tried to have these pre-canned ERP systems that were pre-set up, and that they would like ship the server like right to the client, and it would be kind of pre-set up. And there might be some configurations that they could turn on or off based on like some very unique situations. But for the most part, and I think even at Oracle we had some things like that. I know we had that fast forward, I think it was called fast forward approach, where it was the chart of accounts were like six segments, and
Okay.
that's right. It was just a pre-designed kind of approach,
Mm-hmm.
so there were quicker implementations. That works for like smaller companies, but it still isn't a perfect fit because every company is different. And I think understanding what you're going to do, especially when you're going to maintain that, or when you've got to transact in that system, it's,
100%.
it takes time. Yeah. Yeah. So it's
Yeah, and not
yeah.
only that, but you had mentioned just previously that there's a lot of assumptions that we make in terms of, and by we I mean like the ambiguous we make in terms of when we're setting or say gathering requirements with or trying to understand what those requirements are. Often they're misunderstood. And then if you set up the system, and again, not you specifically, but the general you, it were to as a consultant, if you were to set up the system according to what you understand the client's requirements are, and then later on those guys are like, no, 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 this is what we mean.
Mhm.
Well, are they that means that they're forced to have you again help them, which would be good for you, but really, I mean, is that really the best for the client?
Right. No, no, exactly. And I think that that's, even from the learning perspective, what I find is like even just that transition of learning, because and we saw it even when we were on-prem applications, right? We might go back to a client 3 or 4 years later, and there might have been a turnover of the individuals who were implementing, who had implemented the application. They knew how it worked, and they either got new positions or they left the company or whatever the situation was. So it's new people, and they're really operating with the software the way it was set up. They don't know
Mm,
how to deal with it, or they're building workarounds because they say, hey, our business changed, we've got different needs, and we start to do
mm-hmm.
these things outside the system because they don't understand how the configuration works. Now, we want to limit that, and not have people kind of going in and going hog wild crazy, flipping
Of course.
configuration on and off. But I do think that for people to understand that how something is configured and the intent around that functionality really serves the organization. And I think the cloud, and when I say this, somebody may say, well, okay, well then just fix it, Andy, just go and do that. One of the challenges we have, and I think this is really where the clients and the consulting companies need to get together with, is understanding that the concept of cloud is really stepping away from this magical solution where it's all handled someplace else, and understanding that, okay, the hosting of your applications is somewhere else, but the responsibility and the accountability around how that's configured still remains with the client, and it's their responsibility to make sure
Yes.
that it's communicated properly, and that they have enough people around to be able to support that system once it goes
100%.
in.
So, question, what do you do now? Like, I know what you did in the past, like for on-prem implementations, but what do you do for cloud implementations to ensure that your clients are have adequate knowledge when you hand over the keys?
Yeah. One of the big things I do this all the time, and actually I've done this, I think, on every single project I've been on since I can remember, is walk through and explain the purpose, like, because I work primarily on the Oracle project suite, so Oracle PPM it's called in cloud, and it was a Oracle project suite in EBS. So it's project oriented companies. But what I do is I walk through, and from a very high level, I explain what the purpose of the project system is, what the reasoning around PPM and cloud, or projects in EBS, how the touch points are with the other applications, what's the purpose of it, start introducing them to the terminology around the key attributes and the key items within the system. Many of that is to educate them on, first of all, the reason why it exists, and the purpose of these settings. I try to start as high level as
Right.
possible, because they need to get a
Mm.
framework and an understanding of what it is that they're looking at. I think one of the big challenges that we all get to as human beings is we're operating either too high or too low. So we're saying, just give me the quick,
Yeah.
Cole's Notes version, the
Yeah.
Cliff Notes version of what it is. I don't need to know anything more. And I know we operate like this because if you look online, like, reels and quick videos are, everybody loves them, right?
Yeah.
And all they want is quick pieces of information,
Yeah.
and that's what they want to operate. Or they're too deep, they're too detailed, they're down in the weeds, and they don't understand how they got there. And I think
Yeah.
the only way to really deal with that is we first start at the top and we work our way down. I think somebody may say, well, isn't it better to work our way down and work our way up? The reason why I always think about working our way from the top down is that if we don't understand
The
how
big
we
picture.
that
Hmm.
big picture, and it is not a waste of time. I know it's offensive to some people, and I get offended too if someone starts with explaining something in a very high level, something that I already know,
Yeah.
and I go, oh, I already know that. Okay, let's stop. Let's still work our way down,
Yeah.
because there are chunks that we may not have understood. There's pieces
Correct.
of the picture that we may not fully understand. So
100%. You're just level setting and setting that benchmark. And obviously, the expectation is, yeah, you're going to know some of this stuff, but we need to establish that lowest common denominator to make sure that we've got all of our, T's crossed and I's dotted proverbially.
yep,
Then we dive down into more granular detail, and you've got that. And then you're always coming back up to that top to show where the cog fits in the whole entire, picture of the
yep,
system.
that's right, exactly, that's right.
So this is, I feel like this is not necessarily change management, but it's like an element of change management, right? Because you're really like when you actually like what you're doing right now, you're not really working with the business, like the end users of the business, in which when we talk about change management, we're often referring to, I mean, obviously various different areas of people or types of people, but primarily change management is targeted towards the end users, but what you're referring to are the actual people that you're going to be working with to maintain and administer the system going forward, right? So all of those power
Hmm.
users and all of the IT folk that are going to be maintaining this system, they have to understand the configure, like why you made certain decisions or why you're turning on this configuration and not that, and then what the impacts are.
Yep, that's
right?
right.
And that is what makes you an amazing consultant because I dare say 90%, and this is like me making it off the top of my head, right? I don't have any facts to back this up or anything, but I feel like most consultants out there are absolutely happy to DFY, do it
Mm,
for you, right?
mm,
Because they get to make the cash. And
yep,
that's not, I don't necessarily think that that's the best for the client. Well, that's obviously not the best for the client because, they're going to be bleeding cash forever and then not having this information retained.
right. Yes. Yeah, and I think one of the challenges once we're live, once we're in production, it's really like, I mean, you're now in the mix, right? Like you're now, I mean, you're live, right? And I think like,
Yeah.
and so, if you think of like even a sports analogy, if somebody's ever watched hockey, hockey is a fast game, right? And so when the game is going on, there is no time, like very high level athletes can adjust because they're so skilled. But
Hmm.
there is very little time to do. You can't do coaching during that time.
No,
During the
it's too
game,
late.
and no, that's right. And if you and like so all of that work has to be done ahead of time. And that's really where I think when people only get pieces of the information, once we're live and they're trying to now put it together, it becomes very difficult. It's a very daunting task. That's why doing
Hmm.
that up front as quick as possible is really really important because understanding it and then constantly dealing with the vocabulary and always going through and making sure that what's understood is understood. And I think that
Hmm.
often people just want to go, just show me how to deal with this. I just want to know, just tell me the how. Understanding the big structure of, okay, well, how this whole piece, how this all fits together is really important so that somebody says, oh, I didn't understand if you do this over here, it's going to affect it over there. And that's really where I think that the users really need to understand that, and it makes them really better users. It supports the organization. It's just I think a better overall solution.
100%. So do you still pass on? Okay, so back in the day, we were using Oracle, the A methodology, and then we always had this configuration document. So are you actually still passing on that full documentation onto the client?
Mhm. Yes,
Okay.
yes, yeah, yeah.
Are
One,
there other documents that you are no longer doing because it's now cloud?
yeah. The one document that I think a lot of ERP companies, a lot of ERP methodologies, and I've used quite a few, like there was AIM that was Oracle's, but there was a lot of other methodologies that were out
Mm-hmm.
there. One of the ones that was kicked out was what we always call the current business baseline. So it was really how are you doing it today? And I
Mm-hmm.
remember
Yeah.
when a lot of companies, a lot of implementation companies, a lot of consulting companies abandoned that because they would say how they're doing it today doesn't matter because they're going to change in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And as time went on, I kept thinking, I did like it when we would go through and document how they're doing it today. The
Yeah.
big five typically do that when they're doing their process improvements. That's what they do. They sit there and they
Yeah.
spend a ton of time. How are you doing this today? What's
Yeah.
this? Who touches this? Where does this go? How long does it sit? They go in
100%.
detail, you know, and I think that's what the big five typically do. Big five, big four, big
Big four.
whatever is left. Yeah,
Whatever's left.
yeah,
True.
yeah, but they do a good job of that. And now I think sometimes it's overkill where you're given, a container load of documents that okay, we documented everything and then we go change. But I do think going through that step is important because you have something to base it off of. There's a baseline
Yeah.
to work off of to say this is what we are doing, right or wrong, doesn't matter. This is still what we're doing. And how do we get from there to where we need to be? Um,
Exactly. Because
so
otherwise, how do you know that you've covered all of the areas of all the functions in the organization? Like maybe something didn't make it into the requirements or the RFQ or like the higher level business requirements. That is absolute. Maybe there is somebody doing something manually that nobody really knows about because this person is just doing it, very diligently as a part of the person's work and never makes it into a set of requirements. So it never gets put into the system. You wouldn't
yeah,
know that unless you actually did a diligent analysis of what they do current day.
yeah, that's right. Yes, exactly. And I think that like you said, you see the gaps, you see where there's areas that are going to need attention, things that are obsolete, right? Because there are a lot
Hmm.
of, or things that are unique to that organization or that industry.
Correct.
And then you could say, okay, well, how does this really fit? Because when you ditch that part of it, and we don't do that, and we just jump into the requirements, we're really doing the fit gap where we're trying to map the requirements to the application or whatever the solution is going to be.
Exactly. Hmm.
We're now going from the requirement, not from the business process. And the
That's
business
right.
process really should be, here's the business process that really should drive out the requirement, unless we've just determined it's going to be changed. We get the requirements. Where do we want to go in the future? And then how do we map all this into the new solution, and
100%.
what's missing? So,
Otherwise,
and
it's like wagging the dog.
yes, that's right. I think the one thing that, even knowing what do we do now, that current business baseline, that current review, it allows the client to also question what they do. Because we assume, like, we go into an
Yes.
organization, ABC company, everybody there knows how they're doing things. They typically don't. And when you're in that room, in that, manager of whatever department is sitting there, and somebody is saying, no, we get this, we get this signed off, or we do this, and the person goes, no, we don't, we this is how we handle it, right? They can see where their gaps are in their processes. And then also, I think the big thing is taking it and saying, okay, there's still going to be human beings doing this work. Who's doing this, right? Where are there tasks that are going to fall out? Because one of the things I think with most organizations, I'm going to use a household analogy. We have, like, every household has a mom, or a
Hmm.
mom type of character who's walking around picking up everybody's socks and closing the drawers and making sure that there's not wet clothes in the dryer, and stuff like that. And it might be the mom, it might be another person in the family that's doing it, but there's someone doing that.
The
And
caretaker,
typically
right?
the
Hmm.
caretaker, yes. And they're typically, there's somebody who's doing that and kind of making sure all those things are done. They don't like to do that. Maybe they do enjoy it. I don't know. But most people become frustrated when they're picking up you know,
Sure.
all of everything everybody falls. But they're usually the person who's picking up what's falling. Companies have the same thing. They've got this
Yeah.
person who runs around and picks up everything that's falling, and they're the one who's pulled into this meeting and that meeting and making sure that all the gaps are handled. There's no need for it, right? You need to have these roles identified and these tasks identified to make sure that they're being handled. And I think typically when we're going through an implementation, a consultant will do that, right? A consultant
Hmm.
will go and say, okay, well, I'll deal with that. This has to be done. I'll deal with it. I'll make sure that's working. And then once we go live, there's these gaps. I think, and I'm not going to just blame it 100% on cloud, but I do think it went through the sort of the nature of how implementations have been handled and how they've been rolled out, and sort of the understanding of, or the lack of understanding of who's responsible for what, and how are we going to kind of overlap that to make sure we've got it fully met. So,
Interesting. Very interesting. Now, I've a couple of thoughts. So, my first thought is what you had just said, like the mom, the proverbial mom character in any organization, the one to pick up falling or fill gaps wherever they may be, right? That's like, and the thing about going to a new information system is that you always want to go from people centric to system centric. And what I
yep,
mean by that is that instead of having that mom character or like relying on the people to, just fill the gaps because that's the way it's done. And if you're starting, like, consider a startup, like that's how you have to start because you don't know
yep,
where this, like everything's a gap, right? So
yep.
humans have to fill that gap. And then over time, stuff just gets done
Mhm.
until you suddenly, and I've seen this so many times, like especially recently, where the startups grow and grow and grow, and they're so rapid, and there's things are going great, and then the next thing they know, they're ready to exit, like they're ready to be sold or they're ready to be publicly traded. And even sometimes, even after being publicly traded, they're still running that same system that they used to do as a startup. And so that's when they're like, okay, we really need it. They don't have an ERP, or like they've
Yep.
bought an ERP, they're not using it properly because they still have like three people doing these analyses on Excel and trying to fit it into that half-baked sort of system that they're kind of sort of using, but not really.
Yep.
Right. So like the whole entire point of one of the major values of going to properly implementing your ERP is so that you don't have to rely on these three individuals that who suddenly like for one thing, they're going to retire at one day, right? Or they might leave your organization for better, like for a better opportunity. That's absolutely natural, like natural attrition,
Mm.
right? And then what happens to that gap? Well, then you suddenly scramble to like, to fill that gap. Whereas if you have a proper ERP that includes it, that's already covered that function, it is now system centric, and there is no gap, right? You
So,
simply have to, reassign that task to another human who's actually still at the company, right?
yes, exactly. That's right. Yeah, and I think in most organizations, I think, you're always going to have tasks that are going to shake out just because of the nature of of an evolving organization, right? So as an organization evolves, there's new tasks that come, or like you're right, like somebody who did the work of two people now leaves, and we have to figure out how we accomplish that with one individual, two individuals. How do we break this up? And that normally in a traditional organization, that's normally the falling items that aren't being picked up by anybody is usually handled by your middle managers, the stuff that falls from your executives, right, or
Mm-hmm.
stuff that's
Yeah.
working its way up, and your supervisors. So they're the ones that are typically hands-on, but also playing a management role of some type. And they're usually picking those things up. The problem is when they stay with those individuals, because then what happens is the person says, a middle manager, let's say, or a supervisor says, okay, yeah, I know this new task came on. I'll just handle it. I'll handle it from now until we find somebody else to do it. And 4 years later, that supervisor is still doing it. And it should be worked into somebody else's role and into somebody else's job, but that supervisor is still doing it. And then, but what's happened during that time, there's 5 other things or 15 other things that have same thing piled on that person. Middle manager's the same thing. And I think identifying those tasks and saying, who's supposed to deal with this is really important. And you're 100% right. When we put in a new ERP system, the ERP system is meant to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Typically what happens is this is where it becomes real apparent, right? It's sort of
Yeah.
like when you move into a new house and you realize, where are we going to put
Yeah.
the coffee maker? Where are we going to put this? Where are we going to put this extra bed we have, or whatever? You realize, or we're missing something, right? There's a gap that we have an extra room. What are we going to do with it? Do we have to now make a decision with that? These same things happen with organizations, is that they realize, wait a sec, there we have something extra, or we've got a gap. What do we need to do? Problem is the ERP system should not be the thing that does it. It's just really the thing that usually makes it
That
more apparent
supports
that
it. Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. The other thought that I had is that the implicit benefit of having starting from your baseline set of current as is business processes, like that is to say your current state business processes, is that, and this is interesting because I just finished reading, it's an audiobook. So I just finished listening to Walter Isaacson's biography of Elon Musk.
Mm.
And have you read it?
No, no.
So highly fascinating. And I've always been I mean, people have often various different opinions about Elon Musk. Say what you will, but he's a hero of mine. He's not somebody that I would like to work with or for or even be friends with, but he is certainly somebody who is very admirable. In any case, this in the book he describes something as something called the algorithm, and the algorithm is comprised of essentially a number of different, I think it's like 10 or 12 different, it's like a punch list of items that you would go through when you're tackling a problems or like trying to better some things, right? So the first one, and it could be applied to product development, it could be applied to business process, mapping, whatever have you. But the first thing to do is question all the requirements,
Mm.
question every single requirement, right? And then the second thing is to simplify such that, like, remove remove as much stuff out of the process as you can. And your key sort of your key, what's it called, checkpoint, if you will, is that if you haven't been able to, if you don't put back in 10% of what you took out, that means
Mm,
you could take out more stuff, like
mm,
in simplification of the process, which, and then there's like a whole bunch of other, like meeting one level down from next level, something like whatever. But these first two is very relevant to what you and I are talking about, right? Like question every requirement. You can't do that unless you actually understand what that current state business process is. I've been in so many implementations that people are just running reports
mhm.
because they've always done so in the past. And it used to be, it might have been just like even a one-off analysis that some exec said, I need
Mm,
this. And then
mm,
it's produced on a monthly basis. Nobody looks at them. And yet it's
mhm.
still costing the organization like, I don't know, like $800 to $1,000 to produce one report. Isn't that
Yeah.
crazy?
Yes.
That's what you get when you
Yeah.
don't question every requirement or
Yeah.
like document what that, like have an understanding of what that current state business process is. Oh, I
Yes.
get
No. Yeah.
emphatic about
It's.
this.
Oh yeah. No. 100%. Well, that's a engineering approach, right? Is to when you design something is remove every feature until you can't remove anything more. And then there's other engineer approaches where you add every feature until the thing doesn't work, sort of thing. Like there's
Until the thing
the
doesn't
two extreme,
work.
to the two extremes. So,
Really?
yeah, but it's really kind of trying to work with, what's the minimum. We always talk about minimum viable product, but I really do think it comes down to, okay, what is it that you really need? And I think
Mm-hmm.
with the requirements, without those details and then questioning why you're doing it, is
Mm-hmm.
what ends up happening is you just repeat the same, really the same problem. And you're just kind of carrying through, and we've all done it, right? We've moved to a new place and we've got boxes of stuff that we haven't gone through. We don't know if we need it, but we don't want to throw it out. We just carry it to the next place. So what do? We find a corner in the garage or the basement or wherever we can, storage unit. We dump it there and we'll deal with it later. Well, we're stuck carrying this stuff around for no reason, let alone,
Decades, often.
yeah, unpacking it and actually taking up shelf space for stuff that will never ever use, or we don't even know if we really need it. But I do think that for organizations, it's, you know that current, what are we currently doing is really critical. And we know with any sort of change, right? If we were to try to eat better, that's exactly what we would do. We would just track, what are we eating on a daily basis, right? How many times am I going to the kitchen? What am I grabbing when I go to the kitchen? How far is the fruit away from the chips? Is the fruit further away from because if I'm going to walk by the bags of chips on my way to the fruit, well, I may grab the chips instead of the fruit,
Do you
right? What
really
am I
do that?
doing? Do I do that?
That's a
What?
lot of detail to track what you're eating.
Well,
Like
if you
distance
wanted to,
between your
like,
bananas and the.
well, if you wanted to change how you were doing it, that's what you would do, right? Because you would actually
Wow.
try to look and say, because if I think of, like, if we're trying, like, if we go back to like manufacturing,
Yeah.
right? If we're trying to improve the manufacturing process, right? That's what we would do. We would say, okay, we're going to
Yes.
produce, I don't know, 10 cars, and we produce 10 cars in a day. We want to produce 11. We wouldn't say just start, push the line faster. Or if
Yep.
we produce 10 cars and four of them are junk, we've got to go and fix them. We would look at each stage of the
That's
process and say,
true.
what are we doing? And then we would say, okay, how the material is bad, where are we buying the material from? So
Right.
even that, I know on the eating thing, that's what they always tell people, okay, start at the grocery store, right? Where are you shopping? How are you shopping?
Yep.
Right? What are you
Yep.
picking up?
Are you going
And so,
around the perimeter as
right,
opposed to the, okay.
in the
Yeah.
middle. That's right. Yeah.
Fair. Yeah.
Yeah.
100%.
And so without that, analyzing kind of what are we doing, we just we're going to fall back into old habits, and then,
Yeah.
nothing really
For no
changes.
reason.
So
Yeah,
yes, that's
exactly.
right. So yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Wow, this has been a fascinating discussion. I didn't think that we would, have such an enlightening discussion on current state business process.
Yes, I know. I know. Yes. Well, and I think, and you bring that up because I think it's good for us to do even in our own lives. I know you and I both you have a son, I have a daughter who's kind of entering teenage years. what occurred to me is even doing that. I mean, we should probably be doing that process even in these major stages of life, is even looking at our own lives and saying, what is it that we do, right? What is it that we're not doing? What is it that we should be doing? And a lot of people say we shouldn't use the word should. Well, should is really just saying I should be doing something that I'm not currently doing, or I'm doing something that
Mm,
I potentially should not be doing. It's not a bad thing. It's really kind of identifying that maybe I need to be on a different path, or building different habits. And but I do think this is something that's good for our own lives as well, as just looking and saying, what is it that I'm doing on a daily basis
yeah.
that
Just
maybe
assessing.
needs adjustment? Yes, that's right.
Hmm.
Yep, I like that.
Assessing. I love that. I love that. It's so amazing that, we can I mean, obviously from our experiences, what we do to better organizations and apply that same concept to your life.
Mm. Yes.
So
Yep.
true.
Yeah.
So amazing.
Now I just have to do
Do it. Yes.
it.
All right, so let's wrap up. Today's episode was essentially based on, I mean, we talked about a lot of things. We talked about going from, like, what are the differences as a consultant, like if you were an external or even internal consultant, particularly in enterprise resource planning, like what were the differences that from what we were, because I feel like when we were back in the day on-prem, we had this gold standard of things that we would do for our client. And I feel like because with the dawn of the cloud type of implementations, a lot of that is not necessarily applicable, but a lot of it still is very applicable. And then the question is, how do you make it efficient and fit into the new process in order to empower your clients to be just as self-sustaining once they get the keys after go live,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
Otherwise, I really do feel that we're not I mean, if your clients always have to rely on you for some sort of change in configuration, or like if they have a change in business and they have to like contact you, right? It's not like that's not a good way to serve your clients. Like they're not just simply a cash flow stream for you. Like you really want to empower them to enable them to stand on their own 2 feet. Do you know what
Mhm.
I mean?
Absolutely, for sure. Yeah, yeah, and I think a couple of things is really spending time. And I know when we talk about the requirements, often that I think when we get into the requirements, it's sort of blended in. Okay, what are you guys doing today, and what do you need to do? And it's sort of it's foggy, right?
Mm,
As opposed to
yeah.
just saying, march us out exactly what you do today.
Yep.
Especially, and I think if it's not every business process, the key business processes that
Right.
they do that, and most organizations know what they are. They'll say
Hmm.
these are I think that's a big one, is also identifying and reiterating really heavily on, what is the lifeblood of the organization.
Yeah.
So, for, like, you and I both have worked with a lot with utility companies. Utility companies, it's maintaining their assets, right? It's really those capital assets, making
Hmm.
sure that the power plant's working, the transmission lines are running, that's what
Yeah.
they live by. And somebody else, Amazon, it's fulfillment and their order management, their order entry, their
100%.
website.
Yeah. Hmm.
Those are the two things that have to stay up. Everything else supports it. So I think, and every organization's really different. Industries might be the same, but every organization says this is what we survive on. And I think knowing that piece of it and
Hmm.
understanding that chunk of it is critical, because you can really negatively affect a company if you don't meet those needs. But that's just, a little additional stuff.
I totally agree. I feel like this is going to spawn into, I just have a thought that we can actually carry this conversation into our another episode in which we speak about customizations and how you approach, and how I'm actually curious to know how you approach customizations in a world, the cloud world, where customizations are sort of not very, they're
Yep.
sort of frowned upon. Like you're not allowed
Yep.
to do them. I don't know that you're not allowed to do them. There's like certain things that you can do, right? But
Yep.
I mean, at the end of the day, like you can't expect companies to run exactly the same way. They're like everybody is 80% of the same. The 20% is going to be different, no matter what you say, right? Even in the same sector. So perhaps the next time we get to chat, which is probably next month, we can
Yeah.
kind of chat about like how do we approach customizations.
Yes, absolutely. I love that.
Awesome.
Perfect.